welcome to Collapse Astrology. Welcome back to my lovely returning viewers. My name is Hummingbird, and in this video, we're going to go deep into history to study Pluto returns. As you may know, the United States just completed its first Pluto return, and in my opinion, this is a way under-discussed transit that is immensely relevant to all of the insanity happening in this country right now. And I've covered that in some other places, and at the end of the video, I'll let you know about an exciting summit happening in August where I'll be presenting on the US Pluto return, so stick around for that. But today I want to share some historical analysis. Some research I've been fleshing out over the past few years about other countries and their Pluto returns. Because the US really is just a baby. We're just at our first, but there are other nations and empires and civilizations that have been through many Pluto returns, and maybe there's something to learn from these historical patterns. At the very least, I think it's extremely interesting, and I hope you do too. Before we get into it, just want to remind you guys that I'm super close to being monetized here. I need 1,000 subscribers for that, and we're at 833 at the time of filming. So if you're not subscribed already, I would super appreciate your click of support right down below. Also, I've now got a membership tier available. It's just $2.99 a month, and soon there will be perks, maybe members-only chats or live streams. For now, you get a super cool badge next to your name, and you get my undying gratitude. So just click join below the video if you're able to support that way. You can also follow me on Instagram, and be sure to join me on Sunday evenings for Collapse Times, your weekly mundane astrology report from inside the unraveling. And now let's get into it. So I'm going to give you the TLDW up front here. I researched historical Pluto returns for ancient Rome, England, Spain, France, and Russia. If you want to see an index with all the dates and events laid out concisely, you can find it on my Medium page, which is linked below. There were two major repeated themes. Out of 20 returns total, I found 11 examples of the illness or death of a leader, and 10 examples of significant changes in alliances or borders. For the most part, all of the significant events happened within 5 years on either side of a country's Pluto return, although as you'll see, many of them are much more precisely aligned than that. My analysis is Eurocentric for a few reasons. First, I just know the history better and am more able to put events and turning points into the larger context of the evolution of Western history than I would be able to with, say, India or China or Iran, which are all civilizations that have been through multiple Pluto returns. I also just am not sure how much Greco-Roman archetypes apply to countries that are not the West. I think that Western astrology tells the story of Western civilization really well, but I don't know that that makes it universal. Russia also may not count as the West, but its two Pluto returns both relate to big evolutions in its relationship with Western Europe, so maybe that is why the framework clicks so well there. And for those of you who don't know, a planetary return is a big deal in astrology. It means a planet is coming back to the same place it was in the zodiac at the date a person or nation or whatever else was born, and it signifies a time of integration for that archetype, when its themes really come forward, when there's kind of a full circle moment. A lot of people know about the Saturn return, which happens around age 29 to 30, and that's usually a time of big transition for people where they have to work with Saturn's themes of boundaries and structures and discipline and maturity, etc. Pluto returns, of course, don't happen to individual people. Using the tropical zodiac, Pluto takes 246 years to come back to the same place in the sky, so Pluto returns only happen to countries, empires, or other entities that make it that long. And Pluto is the planet of death and rebirth. of karma coming back around. So its themes are pretty intense. And as we'll see, Pluto returns are usually times of major transformation. A few folks watching might have heard of the non-astrological theory that says empires have a 250-year time span, which comes from an essay written in 1976 by a man named John Glubb entitled The Fate of Empires and Search for Survival. You can read this essay online, but I actually don't recommend wasting your time on it. Glubb was a British military officer who worked in Jordan for most of his career, and the essay is full of smug colonial racism, glossing over of atrocity, and really very little actual analysis. But interestingly enough, he does seem to have tuned into the Pluto cycle. His dates for Spain and Rome track with mine, and his examples of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the Arab Empire, and the Ottoman Empire also make sense historically and fit into the time frame of a Pluto return. Here in the US, personally, I don't think that we will make it through the aftermath of our Pluto return, or at least if we do eventually emerge as a coherent national entity, it will be one with way less international power than we've had in the past several decades. But that's not always true. As we'll see, Pluto returns don't always equate to the fall of a nation or empire. And in fact, sometimes they're actually very generative. They're times of growth and life-affirming evolution. So a quick note here on my methodology. I started this research by looking up the generally agreed upon birthday, or in most cases, the birth year of each country. And mainly this is the date that previously disparate lands were unified under a single ruler. So I looked up Pluto's tropical position for that year and then tracked the timing of Pluto's return to that position, and then researched what was happening in the country's history around that time. I won't get into the specifics of precession, but so it's clear to anyone who's curious, I am using a tropical zodiac, which is why Pluto returns at 246-year intervals instead of 248, which is technically the length of the orbit of the actual dwarf planet Pluto. So you can research that more on your own if you want to understand the difference between tropical and sidereal zodiacs. But I use tropical because, as I said before, I think that Western tropical astrology accurately tells the story of Western history. So now let's look at each country individually and see what happened at each of their Pluto returns. We'll start with ancient Rome. Maybe more than any other country, Rome's entire history runs along the contours of its Pluto returns. Rome is considered to have three historical phases: the kingdom, the republic, and the empire. The traditional founding dates of the kingdom and the republic are exactly to the year, one Pluto cycle apart, from 753 BCE to 509 BCE. During the next Pluto cycle, the republic grew to encompass the Italian peninsula, forming what's known as the Middle Republic. Some historians, including John Glubb, referred to this as Rome becoming the mistress of Italy. So that's said to have happened officially in 264 BCE. And that was also the year that Rome built a navy at breakneck speed, one of its most well-known historical turning points, and set sail to dominate Sicily, which was basically the beginning of early Roman imperialism. Then the Roman Republic technically ended in 27 BCE, when Augustus took control as emperor, and that was another major turning point known as the Pax Romana. The actual Pluto return happened a few years later, so between 19 to 18 BCE, but this 10-year time frame could be considered the most important in Rome's 1100-plus year entire history. Augustus was a dictator who declared himself emperor and abolished any pretense of the decentralized decision-making that the Roman Republic was at least theoretically based on. Augustus shifted Rome into a fully imperialistic mode, and the period is known as the Pax Romana because compared to the civil wars that were plaguing Rome before, it was peaceful. Pax means peace. But it was also a time of rapid military expansion, land grabs, the purging of dissidents. So for better or worse, this set the stage for the next century of Rome's greatest extent of imperialism. So the Pax Romana was at the third Pluto return. By the fourth, in 228 to 229 CE, the empire had passed its peak and was already unstable. Immediately following that fourth return, Rome dropped into what's called the crisis of the 3rd century, which lasted about 50 years and ended with the separation of the Roman Empire into East and West. And while Eastern Rome lived on in some form or another for about 1,200 years, the Western Roman Empire atrophied after the crisis. Its official end date in 476, the year the final Roman emperor stepped down, is just 2 years after the 5th Pluto return in 473 to 474. Next, we'll talk about England. So England actually has 2 possible birthdays, and I tracked Pluto returns for both of them. There's an exact date for the original unification of England under Anglo-Saxon rule, which happened on July 12th, 927 CE, and is generally considered the founding of the English kingdom. And just a side note, that's why there's a specific Pluto degree also for that date, which we don't have for any of the other examples except for the Treaty of Verdun in France. Typically, there's just a founding year, which is why the Pluto degrees for the rest of the examples are also a range instead of one specific degree. And even when there is one specific degree, because of retrogrades, when the Pluto return happens, it crosses that degree either 3 or 5 times, and that's why there's a range of dates for the rest of the returns. So for England, there's the original unification date, but there's also the year 1066 CE, which is when the original Anglo-Saxon monarchy was overthrown by the Normans, and in particular, a guy called William the Conqueror. And today's royal family is directly descended from William the Conqueror. There are also some estimates that about a quarter or more of the entire British population is distantly related to him, so that also seemed like an important start date to work with. And I won't go over all of these. You can look at the index on Medium and, do your own research if you want a deeper grasp on all the history here. But basically, Pluto return cycles for both start dates have multiple examples of significant changes in borders, which align with England's early colonial enterprises as it usurped the surrounding Isles of Scotland and Ireland to create what is commonly known as the United Kingdom. The treaties of Troyes and Canterbury, the Act of Union, and the Triple Entente were all crucial turning points in regards to England's alliances with the rest of Europe. We also see 4 examples of ill monarchs, 3 of whom died within a few years of a Pluto return. King George III is of particular interest, so he ruled from 760 to 1810, making him king during the American Revolution, so the one who lost the colonies. And he suffered from an illness historians believe to either be bipolar disorder or porphyria, which is a rare genetic disorder. And he had his first major episode of psychosis in 1788. There's a movie called The Madness of King George that tells that story. And then he recovered after a few years, but by the time of the Pluto return in the early 1800s, he was still king. He was nearly blind from cataracts, in pain from rheumatism, and starting to fully lose touch with reality. George actually stayed alive until 1820, but handed power over to his son in 1810, just a few years after the Pluto return completed. And in addition to all of these English Pluto returns, there's also the cycle that John Glubb tracks in his essay, which starts in 1707. That was the year of a different Act of Union, which was when England and Scotland were officially united to form Great Britain. Pluto was at 20 degrees of Leo that year, and when it returned in 1951 to 1952, the whole British Empire was falling apart. They were depleted financially after World War II. India had gained independence in 1947, and other colonies like Kenya were rebelling. There was a sick king, George VI, who died in 1952. And there was also Winston Churchill as prime minister, who was sick too. He was both an alcoholic and a heavy smoker. And he stayed in power for over a decade after the Pluto return, but he had a stroke in 1952, right at the Pluto return, that he hid from the public and that wasn't known until a lot later. Next, we'll look at Spain. So Spain is considered to have been established in 1479 when King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile married, which united the east and west sides of the Iberian Peninsula. Before the 15th century, the peninsula was inhabited by a mixture of cultures and ethnicities, including Muslims and Sephardic Jews. And Isabella and Ferdinand were two Catholic monarchs who, once married, set about dominating the territory. So soon after their union, they passed the Alhambra Decree, which ordered the expulsion of all Muslims and Jews who wouldn't convert to Christianity. Also that same year, that was 1492, they sent Columbus out to find a new route to the Indies, which, as we all know, eventually led to Spain's massive colonial expansion. And then at the first Pluto return between 1724 to 1726, there was another ill monarch on the throne. Like George III of England, King Philip V had a long reign spotted with manic episodes. He led Spain from 1700 to 1746, except for a 7-month period in 1724 during the Pluto return, when he briefly abdicated the throne to his son Louis. Philip V was known both for mania and long depressive periods. He actually made his entire court keep his schedule of doing business at night and sleeping all day for years. And ultimately, the 1724 abdication didn't work because his son died of smallpox before a year was up, and Philip V had no choice but to take back the throne. During Spain's most recent Pluto return, between 1970 and 1972, Francisco Franco resigned. Franco wasn't a monarch, but he was a dictator who stayed in power for almost 40 years. And Franco suffered from Parkinson's, a neurodegenerative disorder, and although his symptoms began in the 1960s, his diagnosis was hidden from the public until he took a sharp downward turn in 1972 and was forced to finally cede power the following year. In 1975, he died. So you might be noticing the continuation of the thread here with leaders who are not only ill, but who cover up their illness during the time of the Pluto return, and we will touch on the modern version of that a little bit at the end here. Next, we'll get to France. So most historians considered the Treaty of Verdun on August 10th, 843 CE, the founding of France. The first 3 Pluto returns correspond to a lot of bloodshed. In the first 2, it was just after the Pluto return that the nation tumbled into a destructive psychosis. First time, it was the First Crusade, which was launched by Pope Urban in 1096, and that led the way for the ongoing religious wars that lasted throughout the whole second Pluto cycle of France. And at the second Pluto return, France was deeply unstable and soon collapsed into the 100 Years' War, a civil war between various related factions who each wanted the throne. The third Pluto return was at the height of the violence between France's well-established Catholics and the newly converted Protestant Huguenots. Or maybe it's Huguenots, not quite sure if I'm saying that right. And then at the fourth Pluto return, the violence had mainly happened in the preceding decades, first by the French Revolution in 1789, and then after, as Napoleon came to power and fought to expand France's borders. So in 1815, which was about 6 years before the Pluto return, Napoleon was defeated and exiled by a coalition of Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, who redrew the map and then restored the French monarchy. That also didn't last super long, but at the time of the Pluto return, the monarchy had been restored. And by that peak in 1820 to 1821, a period of tense peace had settled in, but Napoleon, perhaps still embodying the spirit of the nation, even in exile, died one day before the first exact alignment on May 5th, 1821. And then finally, Russia. Russia is a really interesting one. There are only 2 Pluto returns since its official unification, and they're both very precisely aligned with big turning points. So, of course, culturally, the indigenous peoples living in the territory called Russia go back millennia. But 1462, the year that Ivan the Great established himself as Tsar, is considered the beginning of the unified Russian state. Over the course of a 43-year reign, Ivan absorbed multiple other principalities through military conquest, marriage, and propaganda, and established Moscow as a power center. Russia began to function politically as a single unit from this time on, an arrangement that basically remained in place until the breakup of the USSR in 1991. Russia as a unified state also transformed the region's relationship with its Western neighbors, which might be why this timeline clicks so well with the Greco-Roman archetypes, even though Russian culture isn't derived from Greek and Roman society the way that Western European culture is. And Russia's first Pluto return happened at a time that is known as a generative, transformative moment in Russian history. A few years before the exact peak of the return, Peter the Great moved the capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg, which is on the western Baltic coast, and he also established Russia as a naval power for the first time. All of this dramatically shifted Russia's relationship with Western Europe again. Peter is also credited with modernizing and industrializing Russia, opening mines and factories, increasing military production, and encouraging Russians to follow Western fashion trends. And then there is Joseph Stalin's death at the second Pluto return, which I think says something interesting about the landmass and people known as Russia. It was technically the USSR at this time, which was an entity that encompassed the Russia of today, in addition to now independent countries like Ukraine, the Baltic states, and the Caucasus. These countries weren't necessarily part of the USSR by choice. Many had actually tried to declare independence after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, but were forced back under Soviet control, just as they had been coerced under the Russian umbrella by Ivan the Great 500 years before. And after Stalin's death, the most repressive controls on those countries were lifted. And so then when the USSR dissolved in 1991, Ukraine and the Eastern Baltic states became independent countries. And Vladimir Putin, who was born at the unified Russian state's second Pluto return, does seem to have designs on at least a partial reunification of these territories. So that's interesting. And without getting into the messy specifics, I'll just say it's much more complicated than Western media makes it out to be. And if you can stomach it, Putin's 2-hour conversation with Tucker Carlson is actually a fascinating window into his perspective on Russian history and his place inside of it. Okay, so that is the bulk of what I've got. There are a few other things I want to say to kind of sum up the research and share a few thoughts on what it might mean for us today, especially here in America. First of all, doing this research just really drove home to me how bloody and military all of Western history is. And honestly, I don't think that is just the West either. Especially France and England, a lot of the history, both at the Pluto returns and not, is just various royal families vying for power and land. And maybe if I was a super specialized historian, I could have more of a sense of how the common people were impacted and like what was happening on the level of the masses and not just the rulers. But obviously the stories of the rulers are what's considered important history. So that's most of what I had access to for this exploration. And they were just bloodthirsty motherfuckers. So, I mean, empires rise and fall, but that piece has not changed. And as we can see from what's happening at the US Pluto return, it's still the same brand of sickos and psychopaths running things in the West today. Doing this research also just makes me think about how young the United States is. We may very well not make it through the aftermath of our first Pluto return as a coherent entity, and we're definitely not going to expand or evolve during it the way that Russia did during Peter the Great, or the way the imperialism of Rome and England was able to last through several Pluto returns. We kind of did our whole monstrous world takeover during one Pluto cycle, and as I've written elsewhere, we're like a mutant genetic pattern that evolved temporarily into dominance, but there is too much sickness in our veins and organs for this incarnation of ourselves to survive. Maybe it's also because of our technology, the fact that the Industrial Revolution was just getting started in the late 18th century when America was founded. that has accelerated the speed of both our growth and our decline. Now, it is possible that elements of the US will survive, and sadly, these are probably the enormous corporate entities we've spawned, many of which have higher market caps than the entire GDPs of smaller or developing countries. That's related to the Jupiter-Saturn-Pluto conjunction in 2020 and the Great Reset as defined by the World Economic Forum in Davos that year. And that is a video for another time. Also, I found the multiple instances of leaders who were sick and or who died during a Pluto return super interesting, especially, of course, because of America having a president with obviously accelerating cognitive decline during the peak of its Pluto return in 2022 to 2023. That really does apply to both Biden and Trump, although Biden's decline and cover-up is the one that I've been tracking for several years. Biden was recently diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer, and it would fit the pattern perfectly if he were to die in the next few years or even sooner. I think this makes so much sense, too, with the archetype of Pluto, because Pluto is an annihilator. And if you think of a leader as embodying the spirit of the country they're leading, like in their actual cells, it really tracks that that would manifest as death and even maybe more specifically, neurodegenerative illness. One other fascinating Pluto return I just wanted to mention is between 1619, when the first ship of kidnapped and enslaved Africans arrived in North America, and 1865, the end of the American Civil War, and technically at least the end of American chattel slavery. Pluto was at 12 degrees of Taurus in both of those years. I feel like there are probably more of these examples, so I'll have to keep updating as I do more research. All right, everyone, we'll finish here, but I do have some important announcements. So first of all, if you want to know more about the United States Pluto return, I have made other content on it over the years, and there's actually a recorded workshop you can purchase on my website, so I'll link that below. But the best place to get not only a download on the US Pluto return, but also on all kinds of other fascinating astrological subjects is the Revolution Rising Astrology for the Zeitgeist Summit coming up in early August. So this is one of those online summits where there are several presenters, I think about 20, as well as some live roundtables with multiple astrologers. And there's going to be one roundtable on the astrology of the United States, so that's really exciting. I'm honored to be part of this summit along with some powerhouse names like Becca Tarnas and Gray Crawford, and it's free to sign up for the live stream of all the speakers. There's also a paid option that gives you lifetime access to the recordings, the option to attend the roundtables live, and some other special bonuses too. So if you want to join, whether free or paid, please use my affiliate link in the description box. I would love to see you there. And then just a couple other announcements regarding this channel. So as I mentioned at the top, I now have subscriptions set up. So if you have a few bucks a month to spare and want to support me in keeping all of my free content sustainable, you can click join right below this video. And we are now 2 live streams deep into Collapse Times, my Sunday Astro News recap and forecast. In the most recent live stream, I expanded on my thoughts about how young America is compared to so many other civilizations on Earth. In the light of the fake country bombing Iran and all the other warmongering intentions of the United States, I'm really drawing hope from the bird's eye view that astrology helps us cultivate. All of Western colonial culture is only a little over 500 years old, and that makes it a baby compared to civilizations with millennia of history like Persia, India, or China, which have been through dozens of Pluto returns. So as dark and depressing as things are right now, it helps to remember that. The West will not be able to destroy those ancient cultures. There is just no way. And it's only our narcissistic and ahistorical programming that makes us even think that it's possible. So you can find that live stream linked below as well. And please tune in every Sunday if you can for more insight from inside the unraveling. Okay, that's it for now. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, share this unique post-capitalist astrology with your like-minded friends. Maybe also subscribe to my new horoscope channel, Horoscopes by Hummingbird, and I will see you next time.